Hello and welcome to Breaking Ground on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on what's happening on the ground and what new trends are emerging within the construction industry. This show is brought to you in partnership with Plean&aacute, a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sean O'Leary of the Irish Planning Institute, Senior Planner. Sean, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Carol.
Sean, I'm delighted to chat to you today because it's been a while since we've spoken last. And I recall many years ago having some in-depth conversations with you about planning reform. So we won't take out a measuring stick to see how far planning has come in terms of that reform, but you might just share with us, because every week we have criticisms about Ireland's planning regime. It's linked to delays in the delivery of homes of all types and tenures. You might just give us an overview of where you see planning in Ireland right now.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing that I think people need to remember is that the planning system we have now is a very complicated one. It's probably necessarily complicated, but you're looking at, probably 200, you're looking at over 200 plans, from development plans, local plans, strategic development zones. You've got 31 local authorities. The regional assemblies have an increasing role in this as well. You've got the Office of the Planning Regulator and the Department and the Board. So you've got these big, I suppose, central players in the planning system as well. You've got other departments, things like Department of Environment and Climate, taking a bigger role in climate action and planning as well. So you've got a complicated landscape, and then layered on top of that, you've got things like legal decisions and the outcomes of things like judicial review. And layered on top of that again, then you've got, I suppose, changes in European, particularly environment policy, environment protection legislation, and findings, legal cases from Europe as well. So I suppose the starting point is a very complicated system with a lot of moving parts. And then within that, you've got a lot of different actors too. You've got communities, obviously, developers, planners, other design professionals, elected members, and the legal profession, and a range of moving parts in this. And I think planning reform that doesn't bring all those moving parts, it doesn't take into account all of those moving parts, isn't going to work. I suppose at the same time, there's still a lot of stuff in the system that is working. It's about 88% of planning applications are granted every year. There's 40,000 applications, maybe 30 of those kind of getting decided every year. You're permitting probably about 40,000 units, if not more, a year as well. Except a lot of those are one-offs, which aren't necessarily contributing to meeting our housing targets. So there's bits of the system that are working very well, but at the same time, it's very stretched, and there's certainly improvements that need to be made. And then that is something that the Programme for Government and the draft planning legislation has committed to fixing. But I think what maybe the government has found is how complicated it was. And then when that draft bill was published, some things in it became kind of controversial, and there was changes in it that I think probably my fear as a planner, I suppose my fear as a representative of planners was it was changing stuff that worked well. It was making other changes without a rationale, and then it was trying to kind of change the horse maybe midstream without actually a strong evidence base or a strong plan for what it was trying to achieve. And again, as I said, unless you're bringing all those players with you, I don't think whatever reform system we end up with is going to meet the expectations that people maybe have for it.
I think that's a really fair point, and thank you for keeping me honest, because you're absolutely right. We do criticize the planning system and individual planning stories that are coming out on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. And you're absolutely right. We don't maybe stop and reflect on the elements that are working and the vast majority of planning applications that are going through successfully and actually going right through to delivering the vital new homes that we need. So, genuinely, thanks for keeping me honest, because you're right. That is important that we acknowledge that and the work that's being done. Just in terms of the ecosystem that you describe, I realize that even with my cursory knowledge, there's players there that I wasn't factoring in, and that's huge. You cannot, no one body could tackle reform that would bring all of those other players, together, because that's just too many moving parts, but also that's too many maybe agendas as well. So when we talk about the planning reform that needs to happen, how do we prioritize and say, right, we understand that these issues are important, but they can't derail our progress. So for example, we know that climate considerations have to move to the top of the list. We know this, but we can't, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So where do we need to start? Where do we go from this point?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like planning is central to building anything. Homes, as I said, infrastructure, flood defences, renewables. And the planning system is a key part of all of that. The planning system, what it's very good at, is mediating those sort of conflicts and those different agendas. That's what, it's one of the skills that planners have. It's one of the whole purposes of it. I think a good thing about the new planning, the new planning bill, or the draft planning bill that was published, was it had a definition of sustainable development in it. I think probably we need to be a bit more open in terms of talking about what sustainable development is, what our interpretation of sustainable development is, how you balance that environmental and the economic and the social side of things. I think we probably need to get better at talking about the sort of Ireland that we want to, the sort of communities that we need, or we want to have, the sort of cities, towns, rural places that we want to have. We're not very good at talking about that sort of stuff. And those conversations surface, I suppose, some of these challenges and where renewables go, where housing needs to go, and how we get around and things like that. And I mean, there's ways to make that very real. And this is, I suppose, areas that I know you've got much more expertise than I do, Carol, but, things like digital planning. As it stands, we're talking a lot about digital planning and e-planning, but really that's just about planning applications. And that's just making planning applications, I suppose, digital and not paper-based. Very important. But I would argue that's probably not transformative. There's other things like how we use technology in forward planning, how we use 3D plans, how people can actually visualize developments, how people can visualize their future area. All that's the sort of stuff that, again, we probably need to do more of. But I would say that a lot of countries haven't. Like Scotland would be one of the leaders when it comes to planning applications online, digital planning applications online. I don't think they've maybe done a huge amount about that digital future kind of piece and forward planning, visualizing change, imagining that sort of future. I think we probably all across the globe and across Europe can learn a bit more about how we do that. So I think that's one part of it, is actually just what sort of country do we want, being open about that. A lot of these conflicts hit the planning system anyway at the application stage. So the intention would be to try and have those as early as possible. Obviously, a conversation that's going on at the moment is reviewing the national planning framework. A lot of the attention on the national planning framework review has been about census, population, and making sure that that's not a break on ambition, maybe, and that it's facilitating putting things in the right place. For me, I think that conversation about the planning framework needs to go bigger than that. It's not just about census, though very important. It needs to be more about, how you make climate action real, what that means for infrastructure, where you put it, how you connect up infrastructure, what that means for landscape and all these different things. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do. And it's probably not going to get you immediate results, but if you're taking this long place-based approach, which is what planners do, and what the system is there to do, I think it's a key part of it as well. So definitely there's immediate challenges, but I think we need to have those open conversations about the long-term vision as well.
Yeah, and look, there's a couple of things there that I want to maybe hone in on in greater detail, but maybe just start as a non-planner, me asking you as a senior planner within the Irish Planning Institute, what, your interpretation of sustainable development. What is sustainable development?
Sustainable development is getting, there's a definition of sustainable development in the draft bill, which recognizes that there will be conflicts between social, economic, and environmental, and that sometimes, as long as you take the three of them into consideration, sometimes you are going to have one, which maybe will be more weighted towards economic concerns, maybe weighted towards environmental concerns. And then you have a whole host of environmental assessments, which will try and help you mitigate any environmental damage, for example. So, there's a relatively strong framework there already. It's probably not talked about. I mean, the other aspect of sustainable development theory is this institutional part of sustainable development. That's something that climate action, I think, is trying to do, really, that we reorientate everything we do towards sustainability. And you mentioned it yourself, if everything is a priority, how do you make climate and sustainability the priority? That's something that I guess is still evolving. And that's one comment I would have about the draft bill as it was published, is there was changes in it, but maybe again, it's getting that balance right between sticking with the system we have and what works and the plans that people are familiar with, and then also maybe reimagining it. And look, that's a tension. And the risk, obviously, is that if you try and reimagine things too much, everything kind of grinds to a halt, and that's a luxury we don't have either. I do think that national planning framework review, which is going to be completed by this time, by March next year, March 2024, I think that's an opportunity to have these conversations. But again, that needs consultation and engagement. And I suppose the experience we have from the local scale is whether all those actors are consulted now and whether they participate now, or whether they kind of, it's left to the end. So again, you're talking about this idea of meaningful consultation. And that's communities, the environmental pillar, but it's also the development community. It's everyone, what actual shape do we want to have to 2050? And how can we be flexible as well? If our population grows more than we think it is, if our climate changes faster than we think it is going, if there's new technologies, how can we be agile as well? So look, they're kind of difficult things maybe to integrate into legislation, but they're all conversations that I think we need to have as well at the same time, and not just look at the short-term issues, which are obviously very important too.
Yeah, I really like, as a non-planner, I like when you really break it into the simple terms of, okay, what kind of country do we want to see? Because actually, I think that's a really fundamental starting point. And as you know, my passion is towards engaging the community, and I see a huge disparity between our urban planning ambitions and what is I suppose being put forward for our rural development. And I live in a very rural area. I live in an area that has been deprived, it would say, for centuries, not just decades, on the west coast of Ireland a lot of the time. And one of the points that comes up, and I feel quite emotional about this, because actually, unlike many maybe planners that are feeding into policy, I have the good fortune most weeks of sitting down over tea at my kitchen table or somebody else's, and listening to somebody living in a rural community. And just a conversation I had this week involved a man in his late 50s who has fished and farmed and worked the land locally, and he was just shaking his head talking about a particular government policy, saying, why don't they just listen? Why don't they listen? Why doesn't anybody ask us? This is a community that just doesn't feel heard. And when we come to rural development, I genuinely believe that we are moving too quickly for the generations who are actually living there rurally. They're not ready. They're seeing their communities. So, for example, actually just this week, another conversation I had was about a local village that before my time apparently had, a guard, a priest, a couple of shops. There is a school. There is nothing there now, just houses and possibly, I won't say half, but, maybe 30% plus vacant homes and derelict homes, but nothing else, no guard, no priest, no functioning church, no school that's open, and these were places that were thriving communities. And I am very concerned that when we talk about our climate ambitions and what needs to happen in terms of our urban development, I just don't believe that has been fairly translated for the rural communities up and down, particularly the west coast of Ireland, but I'm sure other parts of rural Ireland as well. But the reality is the community does not believe that the state is listening to them. And I believe that that's a problem. Sean, you and I years ago talked about how we could engage the community better. And one thing I know for absolute sure, it is not about one-way messaging. It's not about what we tell the community. There has to be a better mechanism for listening, and that's just not in place at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's regrettable. I think a lot of maybe not in planning practice, but a lot of the discussion about rural planning, it ended up focusing on things like wastewater. It ended up on focusing on things like sightlines, and again, it wasn't really thinking and I suppose focusing on the one-off rural house. Which will probably always be a part of it, and there's always going to be that kind of housing need that will be addressed by the one-off rural house. But again, it was missing the village, and again, I suppose for a long time the issue was people not building in villages and maybe services declining as a result of that. But the flip side of that is, as you said, there's no point in putting all these houses into villages if you're still increasing car dependence to get services that you need. The Climate Change Advisory Council and the OECD did do a nice piece of work about transformational transport and stuff like that, and I'm glad that looked at rural transport as well as urban transport. But again, I suppose what it is for a small country, there's very different rural Irelands depending where you are. Wow. And I think there's quite a good understanding of that in the planning system. Maybe that's not reflected in kind of wider policy or service delivery policy as well. The village in the west of Ireland is very different to a kind of a village relatively close to Cork City or whatever, and the pressures are different. I think planning policy does reflect that, but then the other services, that's part of the issue that we have with planning in Ireland anyway, is generally things like education policy, transport policy. A lot of these things are outside the competency of the planning system.
Yeah, I fully appreciate it, that this is a really broad ecosystem. And in a way, it's because planning touches off absolutely everything that's important to us in life. But actually, that's all the more reason why not only we need to get it right, but actually it's all the more reason why maybe we can't just leave it up to the experts. At the end of the day, planning is a public function. We need the community to be more engaged, but we need them not to be coming from a place of frustration and anger like they are now, or even apathy like they might have been a decade ago. We need them to be coming from a fully informed place. And excuse me, in a way, I wonder, are we maybe, in some ways, do we patronize the local community thinking that they won't understand the complexities involved, when I just don't believe that's the case. I think that actually greater consultation could actually lead to some good problem solving. And you mentioned it earlier that planners tend to have a good kind of mediation mindset. They're good problem solving and mediation. That's how they tend to come to the table. And from that point of view, it would be really interesting to see what the results of something like that, a more two-way consultative or participation conversation with the community could yield. And look,
and I mean the office of the planning regulator does have a statutory public awareness role now, and they're doing a lot of good work in that space. But again, it's that you use, and it's making sure that it's meaningful. And I guess the risk is of that disconnect, that the OPR, for example, can present how it works or how it's supposed to work or the opportunities that are there, but then people need to see that on the ground. And again, I suppose a key point of the planning system needs to be that doesn't take place at the project application stage, that a lot of those conversations have happened at the development plan stage. And I suppose one of the risks is the planning reform bill is looking at 10-year development plans, which from a planning practitioner point of view, I think makes sense that you'd have that 10-year horizon rather than the 6-year one that development plans currently have. But obviously that has implications for communities as well. The decisions that are made in at the start of a 10-year development plan really will have very profound impacts by the time that development plan comes around again. And I think the implications of that need to be teased out as well.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting one. Sean, do you think the reputation of the industry has taken a hit over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it's planning perhaps more than any, from my view, my perspective, planning more than any other maybe built environment profession. Like, it has been very cyclical, and that's one thing that I think we're seeing now, is that there is a significant resourcing issues when it comes to planners in the public and private sector, and just actually the availability of planners. I think part of that is down to it becomes a pinch point when things get very busy, and then when things drop off, the number of planners working in the sector drop off, and that causes, it's kind of a vicious cycle that way. I think that's one side of it. Something that I'm very conscious of, again, is that there's a need for planners in the public and private sector. We're probably short about a third. The OPR, the planning regulator, is estimating that in terms of headcount, we're about a third below where we need to be, and that we're underfunded. And there's 541 vacancies as of last year in the local authority planning system alone. And I suppose what keeps coming back to me is we need to make planning an attractive career for people. And I don't know if I suppose recent developments haven't probably done a lot to help that. And again, I mean, at the same time, like, planners come into this with a huge sense of purpose, with a huge sense of, I suppose, a very real sense of the common good and delivering things. And they can do that in local authorities, in the semi-state sector, working for developers, working in planning consultancies, in academia. So there's a variety of roles that planners can play to try and drive that through. But at the same time, as you mentioned, it can become a scapegoat, which can, and I think we are beginning to see the very real effects of that, is people just being put off entering the career or staying in planning as a career. And that's the concern. But yeah, it's been a difficult couple of years, probably compounded by a lot of obligations falling onto the planning system, whether it's about residential zone land tax, whether it's about maybe responding to the Ukrainian crisis and things like that. Just a lot of stuff falling into the planning system, maybe without the resources or the capacity being built to actually absorb them. And planners have always dealt with change, dealt with changing environmental regulations, dealt with new roles. But I think that can lead to people getting, I suppose, a bit overwhelmed and a bit, losing focus on maybe the core of what planning is trying to achieve. And really, that's my one wish for new planning reform, but also for conversations like this and other conversations that we have, is trying to show that there's a lot of successes, but there's also a lot of faults that we're aware of, and that there's things that can be improved. But at the same time, without a fully functioning planning system that people want to work in, that the best people want to stay in, it's going to make things worse. It's certainly not going to make things better by trying to run down the planning system.
Yeah, and I do understand what you're saying there. One of those figures that you threw out really hits me, and that's, that there are, 540-ish vacancies across local authority planning departments. That's huge. Where are those people going to come from?
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue. I mean, part of it is how we pay for them, I guess. And I mean, the planning system is historically under-resourced. So we haven't looked at planning fees since 2001. So, the planning fees bring in whatever. The planning fee for a one-off house, for example, is €65. The cost of processing that is many multiples of that by the time you do your site visits, your assessments, your report writing, and everything else. So, I mean, we bring in, I think roughly it's about 25 million a year in planning fees, but the cost of processing planning applications is around 200 million. So, like, we're only, there are certain basis, and it's not for every sort of application, but there's definitely some applications where I think we need to move to some sort of cost recovery model, and I think that delivers funding for technology and for people. But the other side of that is that doesn't address a historic under-resourcing of planning departments. As we said, PCMA city and county managers have a figure of 541. and that's technicals, GIS technicians and as well as planners and other people doing admin roles. There's maybe roughly kind of 60, 70 planners coming out of our accredited planning schools every year. We're obviously facing retirements, people changing careers and things like that. Anecdotally, you'd hear of some of the more entry-level planning roles in local authorities being very hard to fill. And again, this is an issue across, I would say, the English-speaking world. So in the past, maybe in the early 2000s, we'd have taken a lot of planners from places like South Africa with kind of similar systems. That's not really there anymore. There's a shortage of planners, I suppose I would say, across the English-speaking world. So it's not that we're going to be able to maybe buy in these people. And then there's another issue, I suppose, just when we're looking at capacity and resources and things like that, is a lot of skills that we might need in marine planning to take advantage of offshore renewables and things like that. I mean, every country in the world is looking for that planning expertise, that marine planning expertise, that marine ecology expertise, and things like that. And again, I think we need a strategy for how we build up our own capacity, because all this stuff is coming down the line, and we are competing with countries and planning systems across the globe. And again, some of that is making it an attractive place. Some of that is making it a good career choice. Some of that is making sure that there's good mentoring there. And I think that's a challenge. Anecdotally, I'm hearing as well, is that planners, public and private practice, are so busy that the opportunities for mentorship aren't there. And that's obviously somewhere the Institute can play a role as well. But yeah, it's a very busy, very dynamic, very important, very rewarding profession, but it's also one that is really being stretched in a lot of different ways. And we need to keep that momentum, I guess. I think there's recognition now across all the industry that a properly resourced planning system is necessary, and getting that in place as quickly as possible is what we need to do.
We've talked about resourcing a lot, and there isn't a Sunday that has gone by where the broadsheets haven't been carrying coverage of the latest coming out of Bord Pleanála. Is it sufficient to just keep citing lack of resources?
Yeah, I mean the board issue, obviously, I suppose the departure of board members, did diminish the capacity of the board to maybe start taking decisions. One of the issues that's been a historic thing, again, it's this kind of cyclical thing, is the board members are appointed by the minister, and there's been several times over the last 20 years even where the board has been allowed to run down to very few members, and then it gets up to its full complement, and then it runs down again for different reasons. And that doesn't. I was struggling to think of another state board which does what the board does. So I think there was probably a systemic lack of understanding of the centrality of the board. It's not just appeals. A lot of their work still is appeals, but everything else really relies on the board. And it's not like the board of another sort of public body. This is the decision-making board. It's the executive board of the organization, but it is a decision-making board. And if you don't have the board members, you can't get cases. You can't get cases out. But at the same time, then, in terms of there's a whole host of, so planners are one part of it, and obviously planning inspectors are central to the activity of the board. But you need to make sure it's got enough administrators, it can get enough ecology expertise, it can get enough legal expertise, and all these things as well. So there's probably a lot of very key things that the board does and key functions that weren't resourced. So it's not just saying, and the board, I think, has been fairly open about this. You can give the board, 100 extra planners, but unless you actually have the GIS technicians, the ecologists, the legal people, and the administrators to back that up, you're still going to encounter kind of pinch points. And it goes back to what I said before. I suppose the board, notwithstanding maybe recent events, I think it is still probably a very attractive place to work for planners, but the planners that go to the board are going to leave vacancies, private practice, in local authorities. And again, the issue is whether we have a pipeline to actually fill those. And what you're just causing is maybe poorer quality decisions if the local authority doesn't have people, poorer quality applications if the private sector making the application doesn't have people and resources. And we need to take that kind of system approach. There's no, we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we keep kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul when it comes to this, and this kind of musical chairs thing of just assuming that we can just deal with a limited number of planners isn't going to wash anymore. We need proper resourcing across the board.
And does this come back, I suppose, and look, I'm conscious of your time, so we will finish up now, but just, I suppose, did this all come back to your premise there that really we need to be inspiring the next generation of planners, so the next generation, and making this an attractive sector for people to consider as a career?
I mean, I think that's very. I think that's probably at the centre of it. I mean, historically, we'd have gotten a lot of a range of backgrounds would have entered the planning profession, and again, looking at it, you'd see that there's maybe some fragmentation in that now. That there's a lot of careers in sustainability and environmental management and things like that weren't there maybe 15, 20 years ago. So a lot of people entering those roles now probably in the past would have chosen planning, and we need to kind of dig in a bit more about why they don't choose planning and why they don't think that planning is the place to deliver climate action, or the place to deliver sustainable development, or the way that they go if they want to change the world in the way that they want to. And I mean, look, there is very practical things that need to be done as well. Is we need to look at the capacity of our planning schools. And again, that they probably need support just to get the numbers through. But again, I don't want to be telling somebody to have a career as a planner. It's very rewarding, but at the same time, if there's a risk that in 5 years' time, if the economy dips or whatever like that there's a lot of vacancy, that those people end up not having roles and things like that. You need to realize that planning is something that you do in good times and in bad times. And that it's and I don't know if that message is maybe getting through, that really it is something that we can that you need to do, both in terms of forward planning, development management, enforcement. There's huge opportunities there, and they're going to be there regardless of what we do if we are going to meet climate targets, for example, and keep delivering sustainable communities and everything else. And again, I mean, something that again I know is of interest to you. Like it's good to see that courses, the numbers in our courses are pretty gender balanced. I think there's a lot that we're seeing a lot more female-led planning consultancies and things like that too. A lot of senior people in planning are women as well. The institute, the president of the institute's a woman. The president of the Landscape Institute is a woman. President of the RAI is a woman. There's a lot of women in leadership positions in built environment and planning too. And again, just which is necessary, but being ruthless, again, it's a very important thing just to actually get numbers in. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is we probably need to look more at how we can expand the diversity of people coming into planning as well. A lot of the universities have very good kind of access programs to try and make sure that people from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds can get in. But planning it's not a cheap course to do. And there's that very practical thing of do I want to do, for example, a 2-year planning course or a 4-year planning undergrad when I could do a 3-year course or a 1-year course in something else? So again, we need to look at how we make it an affordable and attractive career choice as well.
Finally, Sean, you talked about the sense of purpose, and planners generally come into this with a sense of common good, or a sense of what the common good is. Why did you become a planner?
I became a planner because I came to planning from a political science background, and I was very interested in local government. And the reason I became a planner was because it really, any councillor I spoke to spent an awful lot of their time thinking about planning, spent an awful lot of their time getting involved maybe in planning cases, but actually more generally taking up a huge amount of their time was a key function of that local authority. And it was affecting, they saw it, the day-to-day quality of life of their constituents. And I was, and that's why I entered planning, is because I was fascinated about this area that was maybe only one small part of the local authority's function, but which did seem to take, was so central to everything else that they did. And that's how I entered into it. So I entered into planning from wearing a political science and kind of governance hat. And that's probably still the way I look at it. And that's why when I talk about planning reform and systemic change and stuff like that, I'm probably harking back to the young political scientist that I was. But again, I mean, the OPR is doing a very good job in raising the skills of elected members, for example. But we're going to have an election next year. There's probably going to be a turnover of maybe 300 elected members. Again, how do you bring those people up to speed? If your councillor doesn't believe in the planning system, and if your councillor isn't an advocate for the planning that is going on in the area, how do you expect communities to? So, all these people need to be brought on board.
Sean, thank you so much. Frankly, I could talk to you all day, and I look forward to our next conversation. But, I think it's great to remember that sense of purpose that brings us to where we are, because actually that has to be what guides us through convoluted, reform that needs to happen, and overly complex ecosystems. That sense of purpose is what will kind of keep us looking at the desirable outcome, which is a better place for people to live, work, spend time. It's what we all want. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I always enjoy chatting to you, and I always learn so much. So that was Sean O'Leary of the Irish Planning Institute, and that's all we have time for today. My thanks to show producer Katie Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media on sound. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out all of the other real estate and construction shows on iPropertyRadio. Before we go, just a special word of thanks to our sponsor, Plean&aacute, for supporting the podcast and making these conversations possible. Using immersive technologies and augmented reality, Plean&aacute offers a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode, Breaking Ground for iPropertyRadio.